It's an exciting day in the Evergreen State for 9-year-old Candy Rogers and all the kids who take part in Campfire Girls.
We had a campfire mint sale every year. It was a big thing. That's what kept Campfire going.
March 6, 1959 for Candy Rogers started with school as usual, but she also had the excitement of selling campfire mints that afternoon. At the end of the day, she picked up 7 boxes of mints, quite an armload with her school books and the mints. She was a little thing. Candy weighed only 60 pounds, was 4'4". She lived with her mother, Elaine.
She was very shy and an only child.
At 4 p.m., Candy set out in her own neighborhood to sell mints. She visited anywhere from 10 to 15 different homes. Darkness set in at about 5:45 in Spokane on March 6.
When she did not return and it got dark, her grandparents started looking for her.
Family members, neighbors, and police quickly got involved.
That night, volunteers find boxes of campfire mints scattered along the road by the Spokane River, which police believe belong to Candy.
One of the boxes of mints they found on the night of the initial search did produce a latent fingerprint. It was sent to the FBI, and it was never identified.
We were all praying and hoping that they would find Candy. In my mind, she was gonna be fine, absolutely fine.
The search for Candy continues around the clock. Finally, 2 weeks after she vanished, 2 airmen who had gone hunting find a pair of girls' shoes in the woods.
The police met up with those airmen, and they traveled to that site that night, and the shoes were found. Darkness had set in, but preparations were made to begin a search of that area for Candy that morning.
Police search the woods, looking for anything that will lead them to Candy Rogers.
50, 60 yards in from the road, my partner and I came to a pile of clippings from trees and dead boughs. As we moved around it, my partner all of a sudden said, "There she is." All we saw was a little kneecap of a child's sticking out of the brush pile.
The police officers stand guard over what could be Candy's remains until detectives arrive.
The condition she was found in, it would have affected the investigators. They shifted into high gear trying to find her killer.
Cause of death was determined to be strangulation. There were obvious signs of sexual assault.
They only had just so much that they could go on, and that's one of the frustrations that they obviously faced. Then the tips just started trailing off. There just wasn't a whole lot coming in. In the mid-60s, investigators did have to stop because they were at a dead end.
The case of the murdered Campfire Girl goes colder than the Spokane River in winter. Four decades after the case goes cold, Candy's case gets new life and a new investigator who takes a fresh look at all the old evidence.
She is the first to apply modern DNA to the investigation, determining, does DNA even exist on any of our evidence?
The detective found that we had Candy's underwear in a mason jar.
Being in a glass mason jar, this really preserved that DNA evidence.
The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab found semen on her underwear and were able to get a strong DNA profile. That was huge as well.
The DNA profile was then uploaded to the CODIS database, and there were never any hits obtained.
Almost 20 more years pass before another ray of hope appears for detectives when a new technology called genetic genealogy emerges.
Genetic genealogy is the use of ancestry databases to build a family tree around the DNA obtained from the crime scene from the perpetrator who left behind their DNA.
Since the crime lab does not do genetic genealogy, Brittany Wright needs to provide a whole new DNA sample to a private genealogy lab to do advanced testing.
The sample was sent off to Othram in March of 2021. If this didn't work, this case was going to be done.
It's Labor Day weekend, and my phone starts coming to life. I know, this is Othram calling about Candy Rogers. They gave me 3 names over the phone. They were John Hoff, Terry Hoff, and James Hoff, all brothers who lived in Spokane and were now deceased. Genealogy can't differentiate between brothers. They all appear the same in a family tree. My next steps are to narrow it down to the one, and I want to do that through DNA. They're all 3 dead. John Ray Hoff appears to be the only one with any children. I called the youngest daughter first. I said I was a cold case investigator and looking for her help.
So we went down to the detective building and met him.
I compared Kathy's DNA profile to the perpetrator's DNA profile. Whoever left behind their DNA sample on Candy Rogers' underwear was also the father of Kathy.
John Ray Hoff had a petty juvenile record. He enlisted early in the U.S. Army at the age of 17. He was stationed in Spokane at the time of Candy Rogers' homicide. John Ray Hoff was discharged from the Army dishonorably and bounced from odd job to odd job. He committed suicide in 1970.
All signs point to John Ray Hoff. But there is a huge question hanging over the case. And the question is, who is Kathy's biological father?
Kathy's mother had an affair while her husband was in Korea.
The affair added uncertainty to the question of whether or not John Hoff was truly her biological father.
The only way to resolve this is to exhume John Ray Hoff.
They got to work digging the grave and opening the cement vault, but there was absolutely no usable DNA. I decided to give one more shot and try and get DNA from his teeth. I actually had DNA in one of those teeth. I was very, very excited. I ran that sample overnight. When I got to work, I ran to my computer and I opened up the software that analyzes the DNA profiles.
It's October 1st of 2021. Brittany calls and says, "That's it, it's him." Finally, the clock stops. 62 years, 8 months, and I forget, 13 days. That clock finally stopped.
I wanted people to know what my dad did. There's no making him pay for it. There's no punishment. But I'm going to expose him.
I imagine Candy as a bright, bubbly, carefree kid who was living in a world without fear and only hope, where simple things made you happy and there really was nothing to worry about.
What would she have been? What could she have done? She might have been a doctor. She could have been a great scientist. We'll never know that.
Since the discovery of Candy's killer after 62 years, Joanne Poss and Kathy Baird have met and made a real connection.
I haven't had anybody act like they know me. Like we'll never be able to get away from it. But me and Joanne are able to build a relationship out of this.
We need to take care of each other. Good overcomes evil.